Hello, friends. Welcome to another chilling episode of my podcast. I'm your host, Mr. Dark, and today I'm bringing you a story that will send shivers down your spine and keep you questioning the unseen world around us. Imagine moving into what seems like your dream home, a secluded estate surrounded by the beauty of nature, only to discover that something ancient, something malevolent, lurks just beyond the tree line. This is not just a story of a haunted house. It's a story of a cursed land, a mysterious portal, and creatures from another world that refuse to stay hidden. Join me as I take you deep into the shadows of Blackwood Hollow, where one family's dream of a fresh start turned into a fight for survival. Trust me, you won't want to miss this. Lock your doors, dim the lights, and let's dive into the darkness together. This is the tale of the cursed portal of Blackwood Hollow. Are you ready? The remote town of Blackwood Hollow, tucked into the rugged foothills of New Mexico's Sangre de Cristo Mountains, had long been the subject of whispers and legends. Surrounded by towering pines and shadowy ridges, it was the kind of place where sunlight seemed reluctant to linger. Its centerpiece was an overgrown expanse of forest at the edge of town, a dense wilderness locals simply called the Hollow. Few dared venture there, especially after sunset. For Michael and Laura Harper, Blackwood Hollow wasn't about mystery or folklore. It was about opportunity. After years of scraping by in a cramped apartment in Albuquerque, they had finally found a place they could call their own. The Harper House, as it was listed on the deed, was a sprawling Victorian estate on 5 acres of forested land. Even though it had been abandoned for decades, the listing price was impossibly low, and they managed to buy it outright after selling their car and cashing out their savings. The couple's optimism outweighed any reservations. Sure, the house needed repairs, and yes, the property had an eerie, long-abandoned feel, but for Michael, it was their golden ticket. A place where their kids, Emma and Jake, could play in the open air without the constant buzz of city life. Laura was thrilled too, imagining a garden, a cozy library, and quiet evenings by the fireplace. It was a far cry from the chaos of their old life. The family arrived on a warm evening in late September. The setting sun cast long shadows across the forested driveway, the towering trees lining it like silent sentinels. The house itself was an imposing structure, 2 stories of faded grey wood, a turret that jutted out like a watchtower, and windows that glared blankly at the world. It was surrounded by a rusting iron fence, part of which was swallowed by climbing ivy. Jake, their 7-year-old, pressed his face to the car window and wrinkled his nose. "It looks like a haunted house," he muttered. Michael chuckled, though even he couldn't deny the house looked different in person. "It just needs a little work," he said, putting the car in park. "Or a bulldozer," Emma, their teenage daughter, quipped from the back seat, scrolling through her phone. "Come on, guys, this is home now," Laura said, her tone upbeat as she climbed out of the car. "You'll love it once we get settled." The family began unloading their belongings, stacking boxes near the front porch. As they worked, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that the woods behind the house were watching them. The trees swayed slightly, though there wasn't any wind. She glanced back at the thick shadows between the pines, but quickly dismissed her unease. "Wow, these windows are weird," Michael said, examining the front of the house. Each window was secured with heavy iron latches, bolts, and even chains. The front door, an oversized slab of oak, had 3 deadbolts and a sliding steel bar. "Someone was serious about home security," Laura said, her voice uncertain. "Paranoid is more like it," Michael replied. "Don't worry, we'll replace all this. We're not exactly living in a horror movie." Inside, the air was musty and still, as though the house had been holding its breath for decades. Dust motes swirled in the fading light that spilled through the windows. Faded floral wallpaper peeled at the corners, and the wooden floor creaked underfoot. "This place is creepy," Jake said, sticking close to Laura. "Just think of it as an adventure," she replied, ruffling his hair. "Once we get unpacked, it'll feel like home." As the family settled in for their first night, Michael made a point of exploring the grounds. Beyond the rusting fence, the forest grew thicker, its branches interlocking like a dark canopy. He felt a strange mix of awe and unease as he gazed into the tree line. The silence was deafening. No birds, no insects, just the occasional rustle of leaves. By the time he returned to the house, the sun had set, and the property was bathed in twilight. Michael locked the front door with its many bolts and chains, chuckling to himself. "A little overkill, don't you think?" he said to Laura. But Laura wasn't laughing. She was standing by the window, staring out at the woods. "It's nothing," she said quickly, shaking her head. "Just tired." Outside, a pair of golden eyes blinked once from the shadows of the trees before vanishing into the dark. This was Blackwood Hollow, a place where the past refused to stay buried and the air itself carried secrets. For the Harper family, it would be a new start, or so they thought. It was their third night in the house, and the Harpers were starting to settle into their new routine. Michael spent the days working on small repairs, like oiling the creaky hinges on the doors or patching up holes in the plaster walls. Laura was busy cleaning decades of grime from the kitchen while keeping an eye on Jake, who seemed eager to explore the property, and Emma, who mostly kept to herself with her headphones on. For the most part, the first few days were uneventful. But then the nights came. It started with small, strange incidents. Laura was the first to notice. The kitchen faucet would suddenly start dripping, though she was certain she'd turned it off tightly. Jake's toys were found scattered around the living room, even though he hadn't played there that day. A door upstairs creaked open by itself one evening, despite Michael insisting it was probably just the old hinges. The dog, Max, was the most unnerved. The golden retriever had been a source of comfort for the family since they adopted him years ago, but now he seemed agitated. At night, Max would pace back and forth in front of the windows, whining low in his throat, and occasionally letting out a sharp bark at nothing. Michael shrugged it off as the dog adjusting to a new environment. Laura, however, wasn't so sure. On the fifth night, Michael and Laura were awoken by a loud noise outside, a deep, guttural growl, followed by Max barking wildly. The noise startled them both. "What was that?" Laura whispered, clutching the blanket tightly. Michael reached for the flashlight he'd kept on the bedside table since moving in. "Probably a coyote," he muttered, already pulling on his boots. "I'll check it out." "Be careful," Laura urged. Michael nodded and headed downstairs, Max's barking growing more frantic. He grabbed his jacket and stepped out onto the porch, the flashlight's beam cutting through the thick darkness. The cool night air prickled his skin, and the woods beyond the property seemed to hum with an unnatural stillness. "Max, quiet!" he called out, but the dog didn't listen. Instead, Max's barking grew louder as he faced the edge of the tree line, his fur bristling. That's when Michael saw it. At first, it looked like a bear, standing just beyond the fence. But as the flashlight's beam landed on the creature, Michael realized it wasn't like any bear he'd ever seen. Its body was too lean, its limbs too long. Its fur was matted and patchy, with strange, dark growths protruding from its shoulders, and then it turned its head. The creature's face was a twisted mockery of something human, its eyes glowing faintly like twin embers in the dark. Its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, revealing jagged, yellowed teeth. Michael froze, his breath caught in his throat. The creature growled low, the sound vibrating through the still air, and then it took a step closer to the fence. Max went wild, barking and lunging at the chain-link barrier between them. "Get back!" Michael shouted, more out of instinct than courage. The creature ignored him, stepping closer. Michael could see now that its feet were malformed. its claws digging into the earth with every step. He fumbled for the hunting rifle he had propped near the porch, an old family heirloom he hadn't used in years. With trembling hands, he aimed at the thing and fired. The crack of the gunshot echoed through the night, and Max fell silent for a moment. But the creature didn't. The bullet struck its chest, but instead of blood, Michael saw the projectile drop to the ground as if it had hit solid stone. The creature barely flinched. It tilted its head, almost curiously, and let out a shrill, ear-piercing scream that made Michael's skin crawl. Then it lunged. Michael stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the porch steps. But the creature didn't climb the fence. Instead, it leapt effortlessly over the top, its massive form landing with a dull thud on the other side. Max retreated to the porch, whimpering. Michael scrambled to fire another shot, but the creature was faster. It darted toward the barn, its movements unnervingly fluid for something so large. Within seconds, it had disappeared into the shadows. Michael stood there, trembling and drenched in sweat, as the night fell silent once more. By the time he returned to the bedroom, Laura was wide awake, her face pale with fear. "What happened?" she asked. Michael shook his head, setting the rifle down. "I don't know. Something was out there. I shot it, but it didn't do anything." Laura's expression hardened. "What do you mean it didn't do anything? Are you sure you hit it?" "Oh, I hit it," Michael said grimly. "But whatever that thing was, it wasn't normal." The next morning, Michael inspected the property in daylight. He found deep claw marks on the fence and strange tracks in the dirt near the barn. Large, misshapen footprints that didn't resemble any animal he could think of. Laura insisted they call someone for help, but Michael waved it off. "What am I supposed to say? That a monster tried to break into our yard? No one's going to believe that." But as the days went on, the strange occurrences only grew worse. The lights flickered at odd times, and the air inside the house grew cold, even when the furnace was running. At night, they began hearing faint whispers outside the windows, low, murmuring voices that seemed to come from the woods. And always, there was the sense of being watched. Max refused to leave the house after dark. Emma stopped making jokes about the place and started sleeping with her bedroom door locked. Even Jake, who had initially been excited to explore, now stayed close to Laura at all times. Michael tried to keep everyone calm, but deep down he was beginning to realize the truth. Blackwood Hollow wasn't just an old house. It was something far worse, and whatever had emerged from the woods that night wasn't going to leave them alone. A week after the encounter with the creature, Laura insisted they seek help. The family had been on edge since the night Michael fired the rifle. Max refused to go outside at all, while Jake and Emma clung to their mother every time the sun dipped below the horizon. Even Michael, who tried to keep a brave front, had started carrying the rifle everywhere, his eyes darting toward the woods at every creak or shadow. "This isn't just an old house problem," Laura told Michael one morning, her voice tense. "We need answers. There has to be someone in town who knows what's going on." Michael hesitated. "You're talking about ghost stories," he said, but his tone lacked conviction. "It's not just ghost stories," Laura snapped. "You saw that thing, Michael. You shot it and it didn't even bleed. Something isn't right about this place." Reluctantly, Michael agreed, and the two of them headed into Blackwood Hollow's tiny town center. They ended up at the local diner, a cozy but dated establishment with cracked vinyl booths and a chalkboard menu. It was one of the few places in town where people still gathered regularly, and the Harpers hoped someone there might know something useful. "Excuse me," Laura said, approaching the counter where an elderly woman in an apron was wiping down the surface. "My family and I just moved into the old Harper house, and we've been experiencing some strange things. Do you know anything about the history of the place?" At the mention of the Harper house, the woman froze mid-wipe. Her eyes widened slightly, and she exchanged a nervous glance with a man sitting at the counter. "You bought that place," the woman finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Laura replied cautiously. "Why would you do that?" the man at the counter interjected. He looked to be in his 70s, with a weathered face and a trucker cap that had seen better days. "Ain't no one lived there long in decades." "What do you mean?" Michael asked. The man gestured toward an empty booth. "You better sit down for this." The man introduced himself as Frank Jeffries, a lifelong resident of Blackwood Hollow. He leaned forward, his voice low as he recounted the story. "Long before this town was settled, the land you're on was sacred to the native tribes around here. They called it the Valewood, a place where the barrier between this world and another was thin." "What do you mean, another world?" Laura asked. Frank's gaze darkened. "A place not meant for us," he said. "They believed the land was a doorway, a portal where things could come through, things that don't belong in our world. The tribes knew how to keep it sealed. They had rituals, markers, and wards to keep whatever was on the other side from crossing over. But that all changed when settlers came." Michael frowned. "What happened?" "The settlers didn't care about any of that," Frank said bitterly. "They chopped down the trees, built homes, and ignored the warnings. The tribes tried to tell them, but the settlers wouldn't listen. Then the disappearances started. People vanishing without a trace. Cattle found mutilated in the fields. Strange lights in the woods." Frank paused, his weathered hands gripping the edge of the table. "Eventually, the settlers realized they'd made a mistake. They tried to leave, but by then it was too late. The land had already been cursed." Laura shuddered. "Cursed how?" Frank hesitated, as if weighing whether to tell them the truth. "They say the tribe left one last warning before they abandoned the area. They cursed the land, so no one could ever settle there again. Said the things from the other side would keep coming, drawn to what the settlers had done. Some folks called them skinwalkers, but they're worse than that. Shapeshifters, predators, and they don't stop." Michael exchanged a nervous glance with Laura. "So, the house is on this cursed land?" Michael asked. Frank nodded. "Every family that's ever lived there either disappeared or left running for their lives. Most don't talk about it after they leave. It's like they don't want to remember." "Why hasn't anyone just torn the place down?" Laura asked. "Wouldn't matter," Frank said grimly. "It's not the house. It's the land. That portal, or whatever it is, it's still out there in the woods. Sealed, maybe, but not completely. Every now and then, it opens. And when it does..." Frank didn't finish his sentence. "What about the heavy bolts on the windows and doors?" Michael asked. "Did the previous owners put those up?" Frank nodded. "They were desperate to keep whatever was out there from getting in. Didn't help much in the end, though." Laura swallowed hard. "Is there any way to stop it?" Frank shrugged. "The old tribes knew the rituals, but those secrets were lost when they left. Maybe if you could find someone who knows that old magic, you could seal it for good. Otherwise..." He trailed off, shaking his head. As the Harpers left the diner, Laura clutched Michael's arm. "We need to leave," she said, her voice trembling. Michael exhaled deeply. "We can't, Laura. We used everything we had to buy this place. If we try to sell it, we'll lose everything. Besides..." He glanced back toward the forest, his expression grim. "If this thing's real, it's not just about us. What if it spreads?" Laura didn't have an answer. That night, as the family huddled in their house, the woods seemed darker than ever, and in the distance, a faint white light flickered between the trees. The nights in Blackwood Hollow had grown eerily silent. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves. Even the wind seemed to avoid the Harper property. It was as if the world itself held its breath, waiting for something to happen. Michael couldn't shake the weight of Frank Jeffries' story. He tried to bury himself in busy work, patching up the barn and repairing the crumbling fence, but his thoughts always returned to the woods. Somewhere out there, hidden among the shadows, was the so-called portal, and he could feel it, an oppressive, watching presence that grew stronger with each passing day. Late one night, Michael sat alone on the porch, cradling his rifle. Max, their golden retriever, sat at his feet, his ears twitching nervously. Laura had begged him to stay inside, but Michael couldn't ignore the strange sounds coming from the woods any longer. A low hum filled the air, so faint it was almost inaudible, but it sent shivers down his spine. He scanned the dark tree line, the flashlight in his other hand casting thin beams of light through the tangled branches. At first, he saw nothing. Then, a glow appeared. It began as a faint shimmer in the distance, deep within the woods, like moonlight filtering through thick fog. But as Michael squinted, the glow grew brighter, more distinct, until it formed two circular orbs of light, hovering just above the ground. "What the hell?" Michael whispered under his breath. Max growled, low and deep, his hackles raised. The orbs began to move, slowly at first, drifting through the trees like ghostly will-o'-the-wisps. Michael tightened his grip on the rifle, his heart pounding. The orbs began to shift, growing larger and more solid as they approached the edge of the forest. Now, they weren't just orbs. They were rings, glowing white circles that spun slowly in mid-air, emitting a faint humming sound that made the air vibrate. As the rings spun faster, the ground beneath them began to shimmer, as if rippling water were forming over the forest floor. Then, without warning, the shimmering turned into a gaping hole of light. A portal. Michael's breath caught in his throat. The stories were true. The light from the portal cast an unearthly glow across the yard, illuminating the trees in stark shadows. And then they emerged. The first figure stepped through the portal slowly, its outline humanoid, but unmistakably wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head too narrow. Its skin glistened in the light, sickly pale and slick, as if it had been submerged in water for years. Behind it came another, and another, each one slightly different but equally grotesque. One had an elongated jaw with needle-like teeth. Another moved on all fours, its back arched unnaturally high. Their movements were jerky and animalistic, their glowing eyes fixed on the Harper property. Michael's body froze in place, his mind screaming at him to run, but his legs refused to obey. Max barked wildly, his claws scraping the porch as he lunged toward the figures. "Inside, Max," Michael hissed, snapping out of his paralysis. The dog hesitated, growling and barking, but when Michael opened the door, Max darted inside. Michael stepped back toward the door, raising the rifle. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice trembling. The creatures didn't react. They moved in eerie silence, their footsteps leaving no sound as they glided toward the barn. Michael fired a warning shot into the air. The crack of the rifle echoed through the night, but the creatures didn't flinch. Instead, the closest one turned its head sharply, its glowing eyes locking onto Michael. A chilling noise filled the air, a sound like nails scraping across metal, but somehow layered with a low, guttural growl. The creature began to move faster, its jerky gait transforming into a sprint. Michael aimed and fired. The bullet struck the creature's chest, and for a moment it staggered back. But instead of falling, it twisted unnaturally, its bones cracking as it contorted itself upright again. "Oh my God," Michael muttered, backing toward the house. Laura flung the door open, her face pale. "Get inside, Michael," she screamed. He didn't need to be told twice. He stumbled through the door, slamming it shut behind him. Laura grabbed a metal bar and slid it across the frame, securing it in place. "What did you see?" she demanded, her voice shaking. Michael leaned against the door, panting. "They're real, Laura. The creatures. They came through the portal. I saw them. The rest of the night was a blur of terror. From the safety of the house, Michael and Laura peered out the windows, watching the creatures as they stalked the property. They moved with disturbing intelligence, sniffing around the barn and circling the house, their glowing eyes scanning the windows. Max barked furiously, but the creatures ignored him. At one point, one of the creatures approached the chicken coop, its long claws scraping against the wooden frame. With a quick motion, it slashed through the wire fencing and dragged a squawking hen into the woods. By dawn, the creatures were gone, the portal closed, leaving only silence and devastation in their wake. The next morning, Michael walked the property with Laura, surveying the damage. The barn doors were hanging off their hinges, deep claw marks gouged into the wood. The chicken coop was destroyed, feathers and blood scattered across the ground. The grass near the tree line was scorched in strange circular patterns, as if the portal's energy had burned the earth. "This can't keep happening," Laura said, her voice trembling. "We're not safe here, Michael. None of us are." Michael nodded grimly. "I know, but if we don't figure out how to stop this, it won't just be us. Whatever's out there, it's getting stronger." He looked back toward the woods, where the faint outline of scorched earth marked the spot where the portal had opened. "We need help," he said quietly. That night, as the family huddled together in the living room, a strange electric hum filled the air. Michael felt the hair on his arms stand on end. Somewhere out in the forest, the light began to glow again. The next morning, Michael and Laura sat at the kitchen table, staring at the remnants of a sleepless night. Dark circles shadowed their eyes, and the silence between them was thick with tension. The events of the previous evening had left them rattled, more than any of them wanted to admit. "I can't do this anymore," Laura finally said, her voice trembling. "This isn't living, Michael. We need to leave." Michael looked at her, his expression weary but resolute. "We can't. Even if we sold the house, who'd buy it? We'd be broke and homeless. Besides..." He hesitated, his hand tightening around the coffee cup. "What if these things spread? What if it's not just us?" "We're not the ones who are supposed to stop this," Laura shot back. "There has to be someone out there who can help, someone who knows what to do." Michael nodded reluctantly. "Frank mentioned the old tribes and their rituals," he said. "Maybe we can find someone who knows more about the land's history. It's our best shot." Laura exhaled, trying to steady herself. "If you're going into town, I'm coming with you. We'll find someone, anyone, who can help." The two of them drove into Blackwood Hollow that afternoon, leaving Emma and Jake in charge of Max. The children were instructed to stay inside with the doors locked, a hammering reminder of the family's growing paranoia. At the diner, Frank Jeffries greeted them with a grim nod. "You're still alive," he said, his tone flat. "Barely," Michael replied. "Those things, they came back. The portal opened, just like you said." Frank sighed deeply and gestured toward an empty booth. "I figured as much. Sit. There's someone you need to talk to." A woman with long, silver-streaked hair approached their table. She carried herself with quiet authority, her piercing green eyes scanning the Harpers carefully before she sat down. "This is Maria Yazzie," Frank explained. "Her family has lived in this region for generations. She knows more about the land than anyone else around here." Maria nodded slowly. "Frank told me about what you've been dealing with," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You're not the first ones to see the portal, and you won't be the last." Over the next hour, Maria recounted the history of the land, much of it echoing Frank's earlier story, but with greater detail. The tribes who lived here understood the hollow was a place of power, Maria explained. The portal is a doorway between this world and another, a place where the rules of nature don't apply. The things that come through are predators, drawn by life and energy. They're not spirits, and they're not animals. They're something else entirely. Can it be stopped? Michael asked, his desperation clear. Maria nodded. It can be sealed. The tribes used rituals to close the portal and keep it dormant, but those rituals require balance, a give and take. When the settlers disrupted that balance, the seal weakened. That's why the portal opens sporadically, drawing those creatures through. So, what do we do? Laura asked, leaning forward. Maria's expression darkened. Sealing the portal isn't easy. It requires a ritual that takes strength and focus, and it won't come without risk. The creatures won't let you close their doorway without a fight. Michael clenched his fists. We'll do whatever it takes. That evening, Maria arrived at the Harper house, carrying a satchel filled with ritual supplies, herbs, candles, ceremonial objects, and a bundle of dried sage. Where does the portal open? She asked. Michael pointed toward the woods. It's near the tree line, just past the barn. Maria nodded. We'll need to go there tonight. The ritual can only be performed when the portal is active. What about the creatures? Laura asked. Maria pulled a small vial of dark liquid from her bag. This will help, she said. It's a mixture of protective herbs and oils. Rub it on your skin and it will mask your presence for a while, but it won't stop them if they see you. As the sun set, the Harpers, Maria and Frank ventured into the woods. Max stayed behind, too frightened to follow. The group moved cautiously, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the only sound in the oppressive silence. The closer they got to the portal site, the heavier the air became, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Suddenly, the ground beneath them began to vibrate, a low hum filling the air. It's starting, Maria whispered. Ahead, the glowing rings appeared, spinning faster and faster until the portal opened, bathing the woods in an unnatural white light. And then they came. The first creature emerged, its elongated limbs clawing at the ground as it pulled itself through the portal. Behind it, another followed, its jagged teeth bared in a silent snarl. Hold your ground, Maria said firmly, lighting a bundle of sage and wafting the smoke toward the portal. They won't attack unless they feel threatened. But as the creatures stepped closer, their glowing eyes locked onto the group. Too late for that, Frank muttered, raising a shotgun. Don't shoot, Maria snapped. You'll only make it worse. The creatures circled, their movements unnervingly silent. Maria knelt on the ground, arranging candles and drawing intricate symbols in the dirt. Keep them distracted, she said without looking up. Michael grabbed a fallen branch and waved it toward the nearest creature, shouting to draw its attention. The thing tilted its head, curious, before lunging forward. "Michael!" Laura screamed. He dodged at the last second, the creature's claws slicing through the air where he had been standing. Frank fired a warning shot into the ground, and the creature reared back, its movements jerky and unnatural. "Almost there," Maria called, her voice strained. The portal began to flicker, its glow pulsing as Maria chanted in a low, steady voice. The creatures hissed, their forms shifting and contorting as if they were fighting against the pull of her words. Suddenly, one of the creatures lunged toward Maria, its clawed hand outstretched. "No!" Laura shouted, grabbing another branch and striking the creature across the head. It staggered, letting out a deafening shriek. With one final chant, Maria slammed her hand down on the symbols in the dirt. The portal pulsed brightly, then collapsed in on itself with a thunderous boom. The creatures let out unearthly screams as their bodies disintegrated, pulled back into the closing rift. Then, silence. The group stood there, breathing heavily as the woods returned to their oppressive stillness. "Is it over?" Michael asked, his voice hoarse. Maria shook her head. "For now. The portal is sealed, but it's not permanent. If the land isn't respected, it will open again." The Harpers exchanged a weary glance. "We're leaving," Laura said firmly. This place isn't safe for anyone." Michael nodded. For once he didn't argue. The night was unnaturally cold, and the forest surrounding the Harper house was cloaked in a deep, oppressive silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as Michael, Laura, Maria, and Frank prepared for what they knew was coming. The portal would open again, as it always did, but this time they would face it head-on. Maria had been clear. The ritual they performed earlier had temporarily sealed the portal, but it wasn't strong enough to hold for long. The creatures would return. To end the cycle once and for all, they needed to perform a full banishment ritual, one that would close the portal permanently. But the risk was enormous. "They'll fight harder this time," Maria warned as she packed her satchel with ceremonial tools. "They know what's at stake." Michael stood at the window, staring at the dark tree line. He could already feel the pull of the portal, a faint hum resonating deep in his chest. His hands trembled as he loaded the rifle. He wasn't sure what frightened him more, the creatures or the possibility that the ritual wouldn't work. "Michael," Laura said softly, placing a hand on his arm. "We don't have to do this. We could leave, go far away and never look back." Michael shook his head. "You heard Maria. The portal isn't just our problem. If we don't stop it, this thing could spread. We have to try." Laura nodded, though her eyes glistened with tears. By midnight, the group was gathered at the edge of the woods. Maria knelt in the dirt, carving symbols into the ground with a jagged stone. Around her, she arranged candles, bundles of herbs, and small jars filled with dark, viscous liquid. Frank stood nearby, his shotgun slung over his shoulder. "Let's hope those things don't like buckshot," he muttered, though his grip on the weapon was tight. "Everyone knows what to do?" Maria asked, glancing up at the group. Michael and Laura nodded, though their faces were pale. "Good," Maria said, lighting the first candle. "The moment the portal opens, the creatures will come. We need to hold them off long enough for me to finish the ritual. No matter what happens, don't let them interrupt me." The air grew heavier, thick with an electric charge. A low hum vibrated through the ground, and the glowing rings began to form just beyond the clearing. Michael's stomach twisted as he watched the rings spin faster, their light intensifying until the portal burst open, flooding the woods with an otherworldly glow. Then, the creatures emerged. The first one was massive, its elongated limbs pulling it through the portal like a spider. Its skin glistened wetly, and its glowing eyes scanned the clearing with unsettling intelligence. Behind it came another and another, until a half-dozen creatures had crossed through. Michael raised his rifle, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Hold them off!" he shouted, his voice steady despite his racing heart. The creatures moved as one, their jerky, unnatural gaits propelling them toward the group. Frank fired the first shot, the blast echoing through the trees. The lead creature staggered but quickly regained its footing, letting out a bone-chilling screech. "Keep them back," Maria shouted, her voice rising over the chaos as she began chanting in a low, rhythmic tone. Laura grabbed a burning branch from the fire they'd started earlier and swung it at one of the creatures that lunged toward her. The flames licked at its skin, and it recoiled with a guttural hiss, its claws swiping at the air. Michael fired a shot at another creature, hitting it square in the chest. The thing stumbled but didn't fall, its glowing eyes fixed on him as it advanced. "They're not stopping," Laura cried. "They won't," Maria yelled, her hands steady as she drew symbols in the dirt with ash. "You just have to keep them away from me." One of the creatures darted toward Maria, its claws outstretched. Frank fired at it, the buckshot tearing into its shoulder, but it barely slowed. Michael dropped his rifle and grabbed a heavy branch, swinging it with all his strength. The impact knocked the creature to the ground, but it twisted unnaturally, its limbs bending in ways no living thing should. "Get back!" Michael shouted, slamming the branch down again and again until the creature stopped moving. The ritual symbols glowed faintly, and the air around the portal began to shimmer. Maria's voice grew louder, her chants carrying a strange resonance that seemed to vibrate through the trees. "It's working!" Laura shouted, but her relief was short-lived. More creatures began emerging from the portal, their forms more grotesque and twisted than before. One had an elongated neck that arched unnaturally, its mouth filled with rows of needle-like teeth. Another moved on all fours, its back hunched and rippling with muscle. "We can't hold them all off," Frank yelled, firing another shot. Maria's chanting reached a fever pitch, her voice almost unrecognizable as the symbols on the ground flared brightly. The portal flickered, its edges trembling as if it were struggling to stay open. The creatures screeched in unison, their movements growing more frantic. One lunged at Laura, knocking her to the ground. She screamed as its claws raked across her arm, but before it could strike again, Michael tackled it, driving his knife into its side. "Stay down!" he growled, shoving the creature away. The portal began to collapse, its glow pulsing erratically. Maria raised her hands, her voice rising into a final desperate cry. "Now!" she shouted, slamming her hands onto the ground. A blinding flash of light erupted from the portal, and the creatures let out an ear-splitting wail. One by one, they were pulled back toward the collapsing rift, their bodies twisting and disintegrating as the portal consumed them. Within moments, the light faded, and the woods were plunged into darkness. The group stood in stunned silence, the air heavy with the scent of ash and ozone. "Is it over?" Laura asked, her voice trembling. Maria nodded, though her face was pale and lined with exhaustion. "The portal is closed, permanently this time." Michael exhaled deeply, his shoulders sagging. "Thank God." But as they turned back toward the house, a faint whisper carried through the trees, so soft it was almost imperceptible. Michael paused, his eyes scanning the darkness. For now, the portal was sealed. But something told him the Hollow wasn't done with them yet. The next morning, the Harper property was silent. The oppressive hum that had plagued the woods for weeks was gone, replaced by an uneasy stillness. The air felt lighter, the forest no longer shrouded in the same suffocating weight, but the damage had been done. Michael and Laura stood on the porch, surveying the remnants of the battle. Claw marks scored the wooden beams of the house, and the barn door hung precariously from its hinges. The ground near the portal site was scorched black, as though the earth itself had been wounded. Michael rubbed his temples, exhaustion etched into his features. "We can't stay here," he said, breaking the silence. Laura nodded, her arm still wrapped in a makeshift bandage. "I don't care if we have to live in a motel. I just want to get Emma and Jake someplace safe." Inside, the children were packing what little they could carry. Jake stuffed his favorite toys into a backpack, while Emma quietly folded clothes into a duffel bag. They hadn't spoken much since the night before, but the haunted look in their eyes said everything. "Are we really leaving?" Jake finally asked, his voice small. "Yes, sweetheart," Laura said gently, kneeling beside him. "We're going somewhere safer, somewhere better." "But what about Max?" Jake glanced at the golden retriever who lay curled up in the corner, still shaken from the night's events. "Max is coming with us," Michael said from the doorway, forcing a smile. "We're all sticking together." By midday, the Harpers had packed their car and locked up the house. Michael hesitated as he stood on the porch, his eyes scanning the property one last time. The house was quiet now, but the memories of what had happened here lingered like a stain. He thought of the creatures, the glowing portal, and the way the woods had seemed alive with malevolence. "Michael," Laura called softly from the car. He nodded and climbed into the driver's seat, pulling the door shut behind him. As they drove away, the house receded into the distance, swallowed by the towering trees of Blackwood Hollow. That evening, the family checked into a small motel on the outskirts of a nearby town. It wasn't much, but it was safe. Laura sat on the bed, holding Jake close, while Emma scrolled aimlessly through her phone. Michael stood at the window, staring out at the parking lot. He should have felt relieved to be gone from the house, but instead, he felt a gnawing unease. "Do you think it's really over?" Laura asked quietly, breaking the silence. Michael turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Maria said the portal is closed, for good." "But you don't believe her?" Laura pressed. Michael hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't know. I can't shake the feeling that this isn't the end." Back in Blackwood Hollow, the house stood empty. The forest around it was eerily quiet, the trees swaying gently in the evening breeze. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, a faint glow flickered deep within the woods. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a soft, pulsing light that mirrored the heartbeat of something ancient and hungry. Weeks later, the Harpers received an offer on the house. "It's from an out-of-state buyer," the real estate agent explained over the phone. "They seem eager. The asking price didn't scare them off." Laura stared at the phone, her stomach twisting. "Did you tell them about what happened?" The agent hesitated. "I disclosed the history of the property as required by law. They didn't seem to mind." "That's insane," Michael muttered. "Why would anyone want that place?" "They probably think the stories are just urban legends," Laura said bitterly. Michael frowned, gripping the phone tightly. "If they think it's a good deal, they can have it, but we're not going back there. Ever." The Harpers moved on, settling into a modest rental house in a different town. The children began to recover, their nightmares fading with time. Max adjusted quickly, happy to have his family in a quieter, less threatening place. But Michael couldn't forget. Every so often, when the house was quiet and the world seemed still, he swore he could hear it, the faint hum of the portal echoing in his memory. And in Blackwood Hollow, deep in the woods, the glow of the portal flickered faintly, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to stumble across its cursed ground.